Section 25 is a highly visual but very detailed review of the HTSUS. Let's get right into it. What we're going to be looking at are actual excerpts from the HTS. We're going to start with a typical chapter excerpt from the HTS at the very beginning. Chapter 1, Live Animals, with its notes. As we said, if we're starting in a very general sense to classify goods, we have kind of an idea of what we're doing, but we want to go from the very general to the very specific. It's really important to read the chapter notes. That is what we're looking at here. It just happens to be Chapter 1, Live Animals. A good thing about the notes is that it will state, for example, that this chapter covers all live animals except fish and crustaceans, mollusks covered in other headings, cultures of microorganisms, no idea what that even means, but also animals of heading 9508. This will tell us if we're in the right chapter. That's why it's so important to start with the chapter notes. There are also additional U.S. notes. In this case, it talks about purebred breeding animals and what the real definition of that is. Every chapter has its notes as a beginning step in classification. Once we think we're in the right chapter, read the notes to make sure that we're in the right chapter. This excerpt is really where the rubber starts to hit the road. It's a typical chapter excerpt from the HTS, Chapter 1, Page 1, the very beginning of that 3,000 plus page HTSUS document, which, consistent with what we started out with, deals with live animals. Every page of the HTS that deals with actual classification, with headings and subheadings and such, looks like this. Starting on the left-hand side, and we'll see multiple examples of this. So if things start to get a little bit confusing, don't worry. We have many, many examples. Our heading and subheading on the left, up to that 8-digit legal classification. The statistical 2-digit suffix, which takes us up to the 10 digits that we talked about. Really, those numbers on the left, these are the classification numbers that correspond to the article description that we see more in the middle. And hopefully, that article description lines up with the product description found on the commercial invoice from the overseas vendor. There's a unit of quantity. Could be number of horses, for example, being imported. Could be pairs of shoes, could be liters. We'll talk more about that later. And then rates of duty found in column 1 and column 2. Depending on the country of origin of the goods, the classification will fall in either the general or special column of column 1 or column 2. We're not going to go into the detail of that right now. We're going to explain it first in a couple of upcoming slides and then come back to it and really get into the detail of what it means. As it relates to classifying goods, converting a product description to the 10-digit HTS number, every page in the HTS looks like this. In terms of structure, of course, the content is going to be different by chapter and whatnot, but this is what it looks like. Before we get into classification, one of the best places to start is the table of contents in the HTSUS, which of course is all found online. We talked about general rules of interpretation. We'll see those in just a moment. Additional U.S. rules of interpretation, but here a little more detail on general notes. Some of the more important explanations we might be interested in. General Note 3, rates of duty, 10% duty rate, 2% free of duty. That's in General Note 3. General Note 4, products of countries designated beneficiary developing countries for purposes of the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP. That's a preferential duty program that is pervasive in terms of countries of origin that qualify. That means there's a lot of them. General Note 7, another preferential duty program. SABERA, the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act. General Note 8, the U.S.-Israel Free Trade Agreement. General Note 12, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which as of this taping is still in place. We can see Specific questions can be researched in specific areas, when in the general notes, they're numbered. We went through a couple of them. There are many more. We'll be seeing more examples of those when we get into real-world scenarios. The point here, when understanding the HTSUS, start with the table of contents. The GRIs, the General Rules of Interpretation, are the 6, we won't say universally, but certainly for countries that are members of the World Customs Organization, these are the GRIs that everybody uses to create some standardization, some uniformity around the classification of goods being traded internationally. We're not going to go through each one. We will state that there are 6, and the GRIs really deal with the classification of products. We will read through number 1. The table of contents, which we just saw, alphabetical index and titles of sections, chapters, and subchapters are provided for ease of reference only. For legal purposes, classification shall be determined according to the terms of the headings and any relative section or chapter notes, which we also talked about, provided such headings or notes do not otherwise require according to the following provisions. And then 2A, 2B gets into more detail. 3A, pretty interesting. The heading which provides the most specific description shall be preferred to headings providing a more general description. That seems like common sense, but it has to be said explicitly. The GRIs are really quite important because they provide some specificity around classification. We're going to apply the GRIs in those upcoming sections that we've been talking about. In addition to the general rules of interpretation, in GN page 2, as we see in the upper left, that's general notes, page 2 of the HTS, are additional U.S. rules of interpretation. For example, in the absence of special language or context which otherwise requires a tariff classification controlled by use, not essential character, intended use, we talked about this a couple of times, is to be determined in accordance with the use in the United States at or immediately prior to the date of importation of goods of that class or kind to which the imported goods belong, and the controlling use is the principal use. B continues on with this idea of intended use versus essential character. Additional U.S. rules of interpretation must be read and understood. General notes, page 3. This is where we start to get into specificity around importing into the U.S. and how the HTSUS is structured. We're going to skip to number 3, which is what interests us the most, rates of duty. How are duty rates assessed on a product? And we'll provide a spoiler alert. It's based on country of origin in the United States. Of course, it's product specific too, but rates of duty have a lot to do with country of origin. It's a combination in the U.S. of the product itself and the country from which it came. We saw this briefly in our first introduction to the HTSUS, rates of duty column 1, with a general and specific subcolumn. Let's go to 3A2. The general subcolumn sets forth the general or normal trade relations, very important term, rates which are applicable to products of those countries described in subparagraph 1 above, which are not entitled to special tariff treatment as set forth below. In layman's terms, countries that fall under the general column are countries that we like. England, Spain, Taiwan, and others. They are subject to normal trade relations. Basically, the same duty rate applies to the countries that fall under the general subcolumn. The special subcolumn reflects rates of duty under one or more special tariff treatment programs, preferential duty programs like the Generalized System of Preferences that we mentioned just a moment ago, like the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act, as well as free trade agreements. We're going to look at all of them. For now, we can gain some direction, some specificity on rates of duty found in the general notes, page 3. What we will note in column 2 are the bad guys. countries that we don't have a lot of affiliation with, and even embargo from time to time. At the time of recording this section, it was Cuba and North Korea. Not a good idea to be importing from those countries. If you're in column 2 as a country of origin, you're in dire straits, basically. We are way more interested in products eligible for special tariff treatment because, as we see, these are programs under which special tariff treatment may be provided, and the corresponding symbols for such programs as they are indicated in the special subcolumn are as follows. The letters that we saw briefly when we looked at that excerpt for live animals, they all mean something. And as importers, especially dealing with country of origin, we need to know what those letters mean because they could be very beneficial in terms of duty rates should we import a specific product from the countries that fit into each one of these programs. We won't go through all of them, but one of the biggest is GSP, Generalized System of Preferences, as noted by an A asterisk, or A+. One thing we will say, when we're talking about free trade agreements, it's going to be a 2-letter uppercase symbol, as we see in the U.S.-Australia free trade agreement is AU. A lot of people don't know this, but the U.S. has a free trade agreement with Bahrain. That's BH. NAFTA, goods coming out of Canada, CA, goods coming out of Mexico, MX. The U.S.-Chile free trade agreement, CL. A preferential duty program known as the African Growth and Opportunity Act is going to be 1 uppercase letter. It happens to be D here. SABERA, the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act, E or E asterisk. U.S.-Israel Free Trade Agreement, IL. And down the list we go. Preferential duty programs, 1 uppercase letter. Free trade agreements, 2 uppercase letters. This is a second look at what we already saw. Chapter 1, page 1, live animals. Let's take another look. And this is the very first excerpt. And this is all government terminology, so we're covered in terms of political correctness. But the heading and subheading 0101, live horses, asses, mules, and hinnies. The unit of quantity is 1 mule, 1 horse, 10 horses. Moving to the right because we're talking about rates of duty. Let's take a deeper look. Let's get column 2 out of the way, that Cuba and or North Korea designation. Purebred breeding animals, free of duty. That's column 2. Let's put that to the side. We're more interested in column 1 and the subcolumns. In the general column, countries that we generally like. We mentioned England and Spain and Taiwan and others. Duty-free for most of the products we see in this excerpt. But if we get down to 010130.00, asses, that's a 6.8% duty coming out of the general column, countries that fall under normal trade relations with the United States, countries we like. But as we see in the special column, free of duty if goods are coming out of an A+ country, which is the Generalized System of Preferences. AU, that's the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement. Bahrain, BH. CA, Canada. CL, Chile. CO, Colombia. Here's the point, and this takes us all the way back to our module on sourcing. If we're in the live horse business and we're looking for countries to import from, we might consider countries that fall under the special column because the duties are free, as opposed to if we imported asses from a normal trade relations country found in the general column, it would be 6.8%. This is all about landed cost at the end of the day. Good example. We will see more. Let's end the section here and come back and talk specifically about classification and valuation.